There is a Chinese robot on Mars and it's discovered some very strange and new things about the red planet. Like, is there life on Mars? China might have the answer. This is Zhurong. As far as rovers go, it's about medium-sized. Basically a copy of NASA's old Spirit and Opportunity vehicles from 2004, but it's still pretty impressive for a first attempt at landing on Mars. Zhurong launched as part of the Tianwen 1 mission in the year 2020. At the time, China had experience with 2 moon landings, so jumping straight to Mars was ambitious. Prior to that, only 3 space programs had ever successfully touched down on the red planet. The Soviet Union was first in 1971. Their Mars 3 lander reached the surface, deployed its instruments, sent back this one grainy picture of the Martian landscape, and then shut down, never to be heard from again. You might not know that the British landed on Mars in 2004 with a small probe named Beagle 2. Unfortunately, half of Beagle's solar panels got stuck in the process of deploying and it was never able to power on. And then of course there is NASA. We know that they've been very successful with exploration of Mars since the first Viking lander in 1976 all the way up to the present day with their SUV-sized nuclear-powered vehicles and even a tiny helicopter that flew on Mars for the first time. So when the Chinese threw their hat in the ring, the odds were not in their favor. In an effort to maximize the chance of success, a landing site for Zhurong was chosen in the flat plains of the Utopia Planitia region. It's in the northern hemisphere of Mars, which is believed to have been covered in a large ocean several billion years ago. Meanwhile, NASA's Perseverance rover, also launched in 2020, was touching down in the nearby Jezero crater, a region littered with steep hills and ancient river valleys. Now, just because China's landing site was safe and flat, that does not mean it's boring. There's actually a long-forgotten secret hiding in the sands of Utopia Planitia that the Chinese may have come close to revealing. This is the same place where NASA's Viking 2 landed in '76, and it's where many people believe the Americans discovered life on Mars. But if they did, then they also immediately killed it by accident. This is not a story that you'll hear very often. According to the official record, no life has ever been found on Mars. But unofficially, scientists found something really weird in the Martian soil that Viking collected. Since this was our first ever up-close experience with Mars, people of the 1970s didn't know what they were going to find out there. But most of them were extremely confident that there would be alien life of some kind. So they devised an experiment, and this is an extremely simplified explanation of how it worked. They would scoop up some material from the surface and pull it inside the lander to study. Then they squirt the material with a little bit of water that had some nutrients mixed in. The idea was that any microbial life inside the soil would drink the water, consume the food, and then release CO2 as a byproduct. And what the experiment found was that the hydrated soil did produce CO2 gas. So, aliens confirmed, right? Well, part 2 of the experiment was to squirt more nutrient water into the same material a little later, with the idea being that the now thriving colony of bacteria would produce even more CO2. But that was not the case. It turned out the more water they added, the less CO2 was produced. This led NASA to conclude no aliens. But that has not stopped researchers from speculating over the years. If we are talking about a bacteria that has survived on Mars, an environment drier than the driest desert on Earth, then maybe it wasn't equipped to binge on nutrient-rich water. Maybe what we actually did was drown the aliens. At least they died well fed. Either way, that's just to illustrate that there was always potential for China to find something incredible with their Mars rover, even if it wasn't out there rambling over mountain ranges. Zhurong was able to achieve a successful touchdown on the Martian surface using an old-school method. We've seen NASA get creative with some high-tech landing systems. They've used big inflatable balls to land rovers in the 90s and 2000s. Then they upgraded to these sky crane systems in more recent decades. All of this is necessary to achieve a soft landing with a heavy payload. But the Chinese rover is on the lighter side, so they chose a more simplified approach. A parachute slows the lander down as much as possible given the extremely thin air on Mars. And then once they get close enough to the surface, the parachute is cut away and a rocket engine fires up. This brings the vehicle down gently and shuts off just above the ground to let shock-absorbing legs handle the final touchdown. Same way that Viking landed 50 years ago, and it worked flawlessly for both. The lander extended a ramp down to the surface, Jerome unfolded its solar panels and drove itself into the history books. The second space program to ever successfully deploy a robotic payload to Mars. The rover had a lot to do and only a short time to do it. The mission was initially given a 90-day lifespan. Due to the vehicle being solar-powered and the extremely prevalent dust storms on Mars, you know that eventually the dust will win. The Chinese rover has three main instruments to collect data. One is an array of different camera sensors to image the surface of Mars. The second is a laser that can break open the sample of rock to see what's inside. And the third is a ground-penetrating radar. And this is how China started finding some really interesting stuff on Mars. Deep below the windswept sandy surface, Jerome started detecting layers of high-graded minerals. Over a stretch of about 1 mile, the ground-penetrating radar found 76 individual layers sitting between 10 and 35 m below the surface. And these layers were not flat. They all tipped at an angle pointing north towards the lands. So what Jerome was sitting on top of was an ancient coastline with a structure very similar to coastal regions on Earth. The layers would have been created by water flowing down from the southern highlands into the northern ocean. And the depth of those layers suggests that this process was ongoing for tens of millions of years. Not only is that more evidence that Mars had water, but it's also a very strong indication that the surface of Mars was very wet and very active for a very long time. Long enough to produce life. Well, that kind of depends on how old this water actually is. Because life, as we know it, needs water, but it also needs time. A lot of time. Previous assumptions were made that water disappeared from Mars over 3 billion years ago. But what China found is casting doubt on that assumption. The deeper layers of high-graded material found by the ground-penetrating radar indicate a rapid flood around 3 billion years ago. So, it's possible that the first oceans of Mars did dry up for a few million years, maybe hundreds of millions of years, but then the water came back and then it dried up again. But it wasn't gone. The upper layers of high-graded material suggested another flood on Mars around 1.6 billion years ago. That's significantly more recent than anyone had really imagined. So we're now basically cutting the desert era of Mars in half. Meaning that at the same time microbial life was beginning to thrive in the oceans of Earth, there was water on Mars providing a similar environment. But this gets weirder. Jerome continued to move through the desert and began to study these long, low sand dunes on the surface. The dunes are about 30 m long and just 1 m high. So, it was easy enough for the robot to reach the top of the sand pile. And it found something very unusual. The dunes were covered in a very hard, crackly, salty crust that runs as deep as 8 centimeters into the sand. Because of the notorious sandstorms, a crust like that would never have been able to form slowly over time. The wind would just blow it away. So, the most likely explanation had to be that liquid water had soaked the tops of these dunes, then evaporated away, leaving behind the hardened crust, kind of like a cement. The idea is that water vapor drifted down from the ice caps at the Martian North Pole. It then condensed and turned into snow that fell on the ancient ocean